For more on the Dallas shooting, I'm joined now by Peter Vincent. He's a counterterrorism and law enforcement expert who works at BORDERPOL, a nonprofit focusing on international law enforcement. Given your background, I want to get your thoughts when you heard the news from Dallas.
Mike, it's a obviously tragic day, the greatest loss of life for law enforcement since September 11th. I know that law enforcement will pull together, as we should as a nation, and they have punished the perpetrator, they will mourn the victims, they will support the families, and then we will all carry on to do our level best to make sure that something like this never happens again.
Sean, Caleb's, though, talking about, you saying never happen again, these copycat incidents. I know that has to be disturbing to you. What do you make of that?
Well, that's part of the real challenge. They're often called lone wolves in the terrorist world. I call them lone rats. People that are suffering from some sort of mental disability, have some gripe with the government, have some gripe with law enforcement, and take out their anger or their hatred in many cases in a violent way against representatives of those communities.
We have two issues really percolating this week. As you know, the shooting in Baton Rouge, followed by the shooting in Minnesota, 2 black men shot by police officers. And then this second incident, which is a mass shooting in Dallas, police officers hit there. Why don't we begin with the first? There's been a lot of talk about what do you do? How do you address this problem? Because it's an issue that's been percolating in the United States for the last few years, the Black Lives Matter campaign. Are there any easy answers?
Mike, it is certainly undeniable. It's beyond debate that there exists an incredibly dysfunctional, dangerous, and indeed deadly dynamic in the United States of America, wherein law enforcement is afraid of individuals that they are supposed to be protecting in certain communities. And at the same time, those communities, the African American community in these particular instances, is often deeply distrustful of law enforcement. So it creates this incredibly dangerous tension and dynamic, and we've seen it play out in the deaths of many people just in the past couple of weeks.
Hillary Clinton, the presumptive Democratic nominee, saying that she'd like to see national guidelines about the use of force by police, especially deadly force. Would that make much of a difference?
I think it would make a difference. I think the dialogue in and of itself is incredibly important. Whether or not Congress could get together to actually pass legislation that would have sweeping national impact is another question, but having those conversations, talking about the particular issues within our community, opening up and discussing issues of violence and race in and of themselves are important discussions to have, and I think the nation is long overdue for those discussions. So
we started with the first element of this story, and the second element, of course, the police officers targeted, and then these copycat shootings. I know you've been in some tough areas, Colombia, Mexico, where police officers have lost their lives. What does it do to an officer when he puts on his uniform and isn't, you know, they talked a lot about yesterday how they ran towards the shooting, but when you're looking over your shoulder at all times, where there may be a threat there, what does that do to their psyche? Right.
Well, it's an important point to make that the police officers in Dallas were there to ensure that these individuals were able to protest and to voice their frustration with the current system and the deaths of these gentlemen in Minneapolis and then Baton Rouge just before that. Those officers were the first ones that were running towards the violence, running towards the threat that was coming at them with this individual. It's incredibly important that we understand that folks ought to be protesting. It's a healthy sign that society has protests, so long as, of course, they're peaceful and constructive. Law enforcement officers are often so intensely nervous and uncomfortable when they approach situations where they have very little information as to who's in the car, what may be in the car, what those individuals are thinking and what they plan to do. When you couple that with the fact that many officers, especially that work in the more dangerous areas in the United States and our inner cities, don't feel like the community backs them and recognize that the community, perhaps for, in some cases, good reason, deeply distrusts them, that causes additional stresses on them, and it's awfully difficult to carry out their sworn duty when they're worried about not going home at night.
Briefly, because we're out of time, but the one thing that comes through loud and clear in this, it looks as though he had an AR-15. We saw this in Orlando, we saw it in San Bernardino, we saw it in Aurora, we saw it in Newtown. Any chance at all that there might be some limitations passed by Congress on these type of weapons?
Frankly, Mike, if there were no significant advances following the horrific, just absolutely horrific disaster in Orlando when the individual there was using a semi-automatic rifle. Congress could not get together to come up with legislation that would ban individuals that are on the no-fly list from buying firearms. I'm unfortunately skeptical in this case that we'll actually be able to accomplish anything further.
All right, Peter Vincent, always a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks so much
Mike.
for stopping by.
Thank you.